Welcome to a journey through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we start, I'd like to invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from, along with the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places, and at what times of day or night, these documented accounts are reaching. A small notice about a family disturbance in Taney County, deep in the Ozark Mountains, was printed by the Springfield Republican newspaper in the winter of 1912. The article, barely 3 paragraphs long, mentioned that local authorities had been called to investigate the disappearance of a woman named Eliza Whitlock from her isolated homestead near the White River. Her husband, Thomas Whitlock, claimed she had left voluntarily after a domestic disagreement, the newspaper reported. Concluding, the article noted that no further investigation was deemed necessary at that time. What this brief report would be the beginning of was not mentioned by the newspaper, one of the most disturbing cases in Ozark history, a case that would remain largely undocumented for decades. On approximately 40 acres of rocky hillside near the small settlement of Walnut Shade, about 15 miles south of Forsyth, the Taney County seat, sat the Whitlock property. A 2-story timber frame house, a small barn, and several outbuildings constituted the homestead. After moving from Springfield, where he had worked as a clerk at the Heer's department store, Thomas Whitlock had purchased the property, according to county records from 1908. A man of quiet disposition and particular habits was how Thomas was described in these records. Before their marriage in 1905, his wife, Eliza, formerly Eliza Crawford, had been a school teacher in Christian County. They had 2 children in 1912, Edward, age 6, and Mary, age 4. The Whitlocks were recalled by neighbors later as a private family, one that rarely participated in community events. For supplies, Thomas would occasionally travel into Forsyth or Branson, but beyond the boundaries of their property, Eliza was seldom seen after their first year of residence. This isolation was not unusual for the area, where homesteads could be miles apart, separated by dense oak and pine forests, steep hollows, and limestone bluffs. A place where people came to disappear had long been the Ozarks, whether from the law, from debts, or simply from society itself. The Whitlocks seemed content enough during their first few years on the homestead, according to Joseph Miller, whose family owned the neighboring property to the east. Interviewed in 1952 by a researcher from the Missouri Historical Society, Miller recalled that Thomas kept mostly to himself and was particular about his land boundaries, but would not a greeting when their paths crossed. Even more reserved was the missus, but the children seemed healthy and properly clothed. Noted by Miller was that Thomas began making improvements to the property in the fall of 1911, approximately 6 months before Eliza's disappearance, including reinforcing the doors with additional locks and digging what appeared to be a new root cellar behind the house. By anyone outside the immediate family, the last confirmed sighting of Eliza Whitlock was in November 1911, when Harriet Bowman, a midwife from Walnut Shade, visited the homestead after receiving a message that Eliza was unwell. She found Eliza pale and distant with a nervous manner, but suffering from no apparent physical ailment, Bowman reported in a statement given to the Taney County Sheriff in April 1912. According to Bowman, the house was unusually cold despite the fireplace being lit, and throughout her visit, Thomas remained in the room, answering most questions directed at his wife. When Bowman suggested that Eliza might benefit from a visit to the doctor in Forsyth, Thomas reportedly replied that his wife would recover with rest and that the family could not afford such an expense. Throughout the autumn of 1911, Thomas Whitlock had been making regular withdrawals from the family's modest savings account at the Taney County Bank, indicate county records. Between September and December of that year, Thomas withdrew nearly half of the family savings, according to bank ledgers preserved in the county archives. That Thomas had explained these withdrawals as necessary for home improvements and winter preparations was later recalled by the bank manager, Harold Winters. Noted by Winters was that such expenditures were not unusual for homesteaders preparing for the Ozark winter, but for a family of the Whitlocks' means, the amount seemed excessive. Particularly harsh in the Ozarks was the winter of 1911 to 1912. For weeks at a time, heavy snowfall in December and January isolated many remote homesteads, and it was not unusual for families to go without outside contact until early spring. Temperatures in February 1912 dropped to near 0 degrees Fahrenheit on multiple occasions, and several inches of snow remained on the ground until mid-March, according to weather records kept by the Springfield Weather Bureau. That unusual activities could go unnoticed by neighbors for extended periods was meant by the isolation imposed by these weather conditions. Sometime between late February and early March 1912, during this period of isolation, Eliza Whitlock supposedly left her family. Never clearly established was the exact date of her disappearance. To Joseph Miller in late March, when Miller encountered him on the road to Forsyth, Thomas Whitlock first mentioned his wife's absence. Thomas stated simply that the Mrs. has gone away and offered no further explanation, according to Miller's 1952 account. Accustomed to the private nature of his neighbors, Miller did not inquire further. Noticeably changed in early March 1912, show archival records from the general store in Forsyth, did Thomas Whitlock's purchasing patterns. Enough to sustain a household for several weeks without requiring another trip to town. Store ledgers indicate that on March 4, he bought an unusually large quantity of preserved foods, coffee, and lamp oil. That Thomas appeared agitated and unwilling to engage in the usual pleasantries during this visit was noted by the store owner, Jeremiah Collins, in his personal journal, discovered among his papers after his death in 1938. Wrote Collins that he inquired after Mrs. Whitlock's health, to which Thomas replied curtly that she is not my concern at present. Entirely private the matter might have remained had it not been for the intervention of Eliza's sister, Catherine Crawford, a resident of Springfield, who had not heard from Eliza since the previous autumn. Requesting that Sheriff James Harmon investigate the disappearance, Catherine traveled to Taney County after the postmaster informed her that Eliza had reportedly left her family, which occurred after Catherine wrote to the postmaster at Walnut Shade in early April 1912, inquiring about her sister's welfare, according to correspondence preserved in the Taney County Historical Society archives. Insight into her concerns about her sister's situation is provided by Catherine Crawford's personal journal, donated to the Missouri State Archives by her granddaughter in 1961. I cannot believe that Eliza would leave her children willingly, Catherine wrote in an entry dated April 10, 1912. Since her marriage to Thomas, her letters had grown increasingly infrequent and guarded, but her devotion to Edward and Mary was evident in every word she wrote about them. Something is terribly wrong, and I fear what I might discover in Taney County. Dated April 18, 1912, Sheriff Harmon's official report documents his visit to the Whitlock homestead. That he found the property in good order with Thomas and both children present was reported by Harmon. Though Harmon noted that both were unusually quiet during his visit, the children appeared adequately fed and clothed. That Eliza had left voluntarily after expressing dissatisfaction with their isolated life, taking only a small valise with personal items, was maintained by Thomas. He claimed to have no knowledge of her destination, but suggested she might have returned to her family in Springfield, despite Catherine's insistence that her sister had not contacted any relatives. A brief description of his inspection of the house is included in Harmon's report, which revealed no signs of disturbance or struggle. That Eliza's clothing and personal effects appeared to be missing from the bedroom drawers, supporting Thomas's claim that she had packed before leaving, he noted. Concluded by the sheriff was that there was insufficient evidence of foul play and that as an adult, Eliza had the right to leave her family if she chose. With Catherine Crawford's reluctant acceptance of this conclusion, the official investigation ended. What came to light in his personal papers discovered after his death in 1931 was what Harmon's report failed to mention, that he had observed several concerning details during his visit to the Whitlock property. Whitlock was too composed for a man recently abandoned, Harmon wrote in a personal notebook separate from his official records. The children watched their father's face before answering any question, no matter how innocuous. The boy began to speak about his mother but stopped abruptly when Thomas cleared his throat. Most troubling was the fresh-turned earth behind the house, which Whitlock claimed was a garden plot, though it was an odd time for planting and shaped more like a trench than a garden bed. Suspicions about Thomas Whitlock were harbored by Harmon, but he lacked sufficient evidence to pursue them further, suggests Harmon's private note. Without a body or a witness, there is no crime to investigate, wrote the sheriff. Mrs. Crawford's concerns, while understandable, do not constitute proof. In these hills, family matters are generally considered private, and the county lacks resources for extended investigations based on mere suspicion. The limited law enforcement capabilities and cultural attitudes of rural Missouri in the early 20th century were reflected in this reluctance to intervene without concrete evidence. To Springfield after her meeting with Sheriff Harmon returned Catherine Crawford, but her concerns about her sister's fate remained. She attempted to maintain contact with her niece and nephew by sending letters and small gifts, but received only brief formal acknowledgments from Thomas in return, according to her journal. Hoping to visit the children, she traveled once more to Taney County in June 1912, but was turned away by Thomas, who informed her that her presence was disruptive to the household routine. "I fear I have failed Eliza," reads Catherine's final journal entry regarding the matter, dated July 3, 1912. "Without proof or legal standing, I cannot force my way into Thomas's home or remove the children. I can only pray that if Eliza is alive somewhere, she will find her way back to them. Or at least to me." A private matter known only to her immediate family and a few locals remained the disappearance of Eliza Whitlock for several years. Raising his children with occasional assistance from a local woman, Martha Jenkins, who came to help with household tasks several times a week, Thomas continued to operate the homestead. That Thomas had instructed her never to discuss Eliza with the children and to tell them, if they asked, that their mother would return when she was better. Jenkins, who began working at the Whitlock home in the summer of 1912, later told a neighbor. Briefly interviewed by Sheriff Masterson during the 1952 investigation was Jenkins. By then an elderly woman living in a nursing home in Branson, she recalled several unusual aspects of her employment at the Whitlock home. That Thomas had established strict rules about certain areas of the property that were to be avoided, she said, according to the transcript of this interview preserved in the county archives. He would not allow anyone near the root cellar he had built, she said. Once when young Mary wandered toward it, Thomas grabbed her so roughly that she cried out. He later apologized, saying there were dangerous tools stored there that might harm the children. That Thomas frequently suffered from insomnia and would pace the house at night was also reported by Jenkins. She arrived on several occasions in the morning to find him sitting at the kitchen table, apparently having been awake all night, muttering about keeping watch and maintaining the barriers. Admitted by Jenkins was that she found these behaviors concerning, but she attributed them to the stress of raising two children alone. Reluctant to interfere in what she considered private family matters, she was, like many in the community. Beginning in 1913, Edward and Mary Whitlock attended the one-room schoolhouse in Walnut Shade. That both children were abnormally withdrawn and that Edward in particular exhibited a worrying tendency toward prolonged silences was noted by their teacher, Abigail Thornton, in her personal diary. An incident in October 1913 was recorded by Thornton when a female visitor to the school attempted to engage Mary in conversation about her mother. According to Thornton, Mary became visibly distressed, and later that day, Thomas Whitlock arrived at the school, removed both children, and kept them home for nearly 2 weeks. Several other observations about the Whitlock children are contained in Thornton's diary, which remained in private hands until being donated to the Taney County Historical Society in 1965. she noted that Edward often arrived at school with dark circles under his eyes, explaining that the noises kept him awake at night. When asked what noises he meant, the boy refused to elaborate. Though younger, Mary seemed to adapt better to school life, but displayed what Thornton described as an unusual preoccupation with burial. A series of drawings in Mary's desk was recorded as found by the teacher, depicting what appeared to be a figure lying underground with flowers growing above. Increasingly concerning became Edward Whitlock's behavior in the spring of 1914, according to Thornton's diary. He began having what the teacher described as episodes, periods when he would become unresponsive, staring fixedly at nothing. Following one such episode, during which Edward had whispered repeatedly, "She's still digging," Thornton attempted to discuss the boy's welfare with Thomas. "Mr. Whitlock received my concerns with cold anger," reads her diary entry for April 12, 1914. "He informed me that his son's education was his business, and my observations were unwelcome. I fear for these children, but what can I do? Mr. Whitlock has threatened to remove them from school permanently if I pursue the matter." Until 1917, when Thomas abruptly sold the homestead and moved with the children to Kansas City, the Whitlock family continued their isolated existence. That the property was sold to James Harker, a cattle rancher from Arkansas, for significantly less than its assessed value, indicate county records. That Thomas seemed eager to conclude the sale quickly and had accepted the first offer presented, Harker later commented to neighbors. With increased scrutiny from local authorities coincided the timing of the Whitlock family's departure. That Abigail Thornton had finally reported her concerns about the Whitlock children to the county superintendent in March 1917 was revealed by records from the Taney County School Board discovered during the 1952 investigation. A letter to Thomas requesting a meeting to discuss the children's welfare had been subsequently initiated by the superintendent, sending an inquiry. This letter was delivered on April 3, 1917, according to post office records. The following day, Thomas listed the property for sale and had completed the transaction by the end of the month. Several modifications to the homestead were made by James Harker, who purchased the Whitlock property, including demolishing what remained of the root cellar behind the house. That his father had described the cellar as peculiar, deeper than necessary for storing produce, and divided into sections by interior walls, recalled William Harker, James's son, in a statement given to investigators in 1952. That his father had found several unusual items during the demolition, including a woman's hairbrush with dark hairs still entangled in the bristles, buried approximately 2 feet below the cellar floor, stated William Harker. At the time, his father had thought little of the discovery, assuming it was merely discarded household debris, according to William. Until 1933, when economic hardship forced them to sell during the Great Depression, the Harker family maintained ownership of the former Whitlock property. Gradually falling into disrepair as the original buildings aged and newer residents focused on other areas of the property, the homestead passed through several owners over the next 2 decades. By 1950, largely abandoned was the house, with local teenagers occasionally using it as a meeting place, giving rise to rumors that the property was haunted by a crying woman who could sometimes be heard on quiet nights. From local memory faded the story of Eliza Whitlock's disappearance for the next several decades. The family's departure from the area combined with the disruption of World War I and the subsequent influenza epidemic pushed the unresolved matter into obscurity. Had it not been for a discovery made in 1952, it might have remained there permanently, when the former Whitlock property, by then abandoned and overgrown, was purchased by Walter and Ruth Simmons, a couple from St. Louis planning to establish a hunting lodge. According to a report filed with the Taney County Sheriff's Department on June 12, 1952, the Simmons were clearing brush behind the deteriorating house when they uncovered what appeared to be the collapsed entrance to an old root cellar or storage space. A small leather-bound book wedged between 2 of the limestone blocks that had formed the cellar's foundation was discovered by them upon closer inspection. Identified as a personal diary belonging to Eliza Whitlock with entries dating from January 1910 to February 1912, the book was severely damaged by moisture and time. Her first impression of the book was later recalled by Ruth Simmons, who made the initial discovery of the diary, in an interview with the Springfield News Leader. The pages were stuck together, and much of the ink had run, but you could still make out the handwriting in places. What struck me immediately was the change in the writer's penmanship over time. The early entries were neat and controlled, while the later ones became increasingly erratic, as if written by someone in a state of agitation or fear. A renewed investigation by Sheriff William Masterson was prompted by the discovery of the diary. A disturbing account of the final years of Eliza Whitlock's life was revealed by the contents of the diary, partially legible despite the damage. Initially documenting mundane aspects of rural life, the entries gradually shifted to express Eliza's increasing anxiety about her husband's behavior. "T watches constantly," she wrote in an entry dated August 14, 1911. "Says the house is not secure enough. Speaks of dangers I cannot see. When I suggested visiting my sister, his face changed in a way I cannot describe. The children are forbidden to wander beyond the yard now," stated another entry dated October 3, 1911. "T has nailed shut the window in our bedroom. Says it is to keep out the cold. But the first frost has not even come." In November 1911, coinciding with Harriet Bowman's visit, began the diary's most concerning entries. "The midwife came today," Eliza wrote. "I wanted to speak freely, but could not with him standing there listening to every word. When she left, T said no one else would be permitted to enter our house. He says they bring contamination from town." In December, she recorded, "The new room beneath the house is nearly completed. T works on it when he thinks I am asleep. He speaks of it as a sanctuary, but it feels more like a tomb. I found Edward this morning standing at the entrance to the cellar, staring at the door," reads a particularly disturbing entry dated January 8, 1912. "When I asked what he was doing, he said, 'Father says we'll all sleep there soon when the time comes.' When I questioned T about this, he became enraged, accusing me of turning the children against him. He did not leave my side for the remainder of the day." Shorter and more fragmented became Eliza's entries as January progressed. "The tonic he prepares each evening leaves me groggy and confused the next day," she wrote on January 23. "I began pouring it into my potted plant when he isn't looking. The plant died within days. I must get the children away from here," simply states another entry dated February 2. "But how? The snow is deep and we are miles from town. T has hidden my boots and coat. He says it is to prevent me from falling ill, but I know the truth." Just 3 lines were contained in the final readable entry, dated February 17, 1912. "He found these pages tonight. His rage was terrible. The children are locked in their room. I hear him digging again." Based on the diary's contents, an excavation of the area where the root cellar had been located was ordered by Sheriff Masterson. On June 18, 1952, human remains were uncovered by investigators, later identified through dental records as those of Eliza Whitlock. That she had suffered blunt force trauma to the skull prior to burial was determined by medical examination. That she had been placed face down in a shallow grave with her hands bound behind her back with wire was suggested by the position of the remains. Several additional details in his report were noted by Dr. Lawrence Wilson, the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy on Eliza's remains. That Eliza had been approximately 32 years old at the time of death, consistent with her known age, was determined by Wilson. A previous fracture to her left wrist that had healed sometime before her death was also found by him, an injury not mentioned in any known records. Most significantly, traces of a sedative compound in the preserved tissue samples were identified by Wilson, suggesting that Eliza may have been drugged prior to her death. Her diary entries about a tonic Thomas had insisted she consume were corroborated by this finding. Following the discovery, authorities attempted to locate Thomas Whitlock and his children, but the investigation revealed that Thomas had died in a Kansas City hospital in 1931 from complications related to pneumonia. In 1944, during World War II, Edward Whitlock had been killed in action. Only Mary Whitlock, by then Mary Coleman, was still living, residing in Omaha, Nebraska, with her husband and 3 children. Some information about the Whitlock family's life after leaving Taney County was provided by records from the Kansas City Public Library examined during the investigation. That Thomas had worked as a night watchman at a warehouse from 1917 until 1928, when health problems forced him to retire, showed city directories. At the same warehouse, Edward had taken a job after attending school through the 8th grade. As a strict father who kept to himself but was not notably unusual in his behavior was how Thomas was described by neighbors from that period, tracked down by investigators. That Thomas never spoke of his late wife and became agitated if anyone inquired about the children's mother was recalled by one former neighbor, Estelle Parker. In 1929, Mary Whitlock had married Richard Coleman, an insurance salesman, and moved to Omaha shortly thereafter. That she had listed her mother as deceased on the application, though no death certificate for Eliza existed at that time, is shown by marriage records. This suggested that either Thomas had told his daughter that her mother had died or Mary herself had chosen to represent her absent mother this way. When contacted by Missouri authorities in July 1952, Mary Coleman claimed to have no recollection of the events surrounding her mother's disappearance. That her father had always told her that her mother had abandoned the family and she had no reason to question this account, she stated. However, privately later contacted investigators by Coleman's husband, reporting that his wife suffered from recurring nightmares about a woman calling from beneath the floorboards and had always exhibited an extreme fear of enclosed spaces. Additional information about his wife's psychological state was provided to investigators by Richard Coleman. Mary has suffered from what doctors now call anxiety attacks throughout our marriage, he wrote in a letter preserved in the case file. These episodes are often triggered by certain sounds, particularly the sound of digging or scraping, or by the sight of certain objects, including gardening tools and root cellars. For years, she has refused to enter our basement or any underground space. When I asked about the origin of these fears, she would become distant and change the subject. Through interviews with former residents of Taney County who had known the Whitlock family, the investigation revealed additional details. That her father had once encountered Thomas Whitlock in Forsyth purchasing an unusual amount of quicklime from the hardware store was recalled by Clara Jensen, who had been a young girl living near Walnut Shade in 1912. For preserving the root cellar walls against moisture, Thomas had explained the purchase when questioned about it, Jensen recalled. Strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitlock property late at night during that winter were also remembered by Jensen, sounds her father had attributed to wild animals or the wind in the hollow. A written statement describing an encounter he had with Edward Whitlock in the spring of 1912 was provided by Jensen's brother, Harold. According to this statement, Harold had encountered Edward near the property line separating their family's lands. The Whitlock boy had appeared distressed and asked Harold if people could hear things through the ground. When Harold asked what he meant, Edward had replied, "Father says no one can hear anything through the ground once it's packed down tight, but I think I can still hear her sometimes." Before Harold could inquire further, Thomas Whitlock had appeared, calling his son home. The strange conversation had been mentioned by Harold to his parents, but they had dismissed it as childish imagination. A possible explanation for his increasingly paranoid behavior in the months preceding Eliza's disappearance was uncovered by further research into Thomas Whitlock's background. That Thomas's father, William Whitlock, had been committed to the institution in 1890 after exhibiting violent paranoid delusions was revealed by records from the State Lunatic Asylum in Nevada, Missouri, now known as the Nevada State Hospital. Convinced that his wife was conspiring against him with neighbors, the elder Whitlock had reportedly become and had attempted to imprison her in their home. That William Whitlock died in the asylum in 1902, with notes describing a hereditary tendency toward paranoid ideation, indicated hospital records. A letter from Thomas's mother, Sarah Whitlock, written to the hospital director in 1895, was also contained in the asylum records. In this letter, she expressed concern about her son's nervous disposition and inquired whether her husband's condition might be passed to their children. The director's response, also preserved in the file, assured Sarah that mental aberrations are not necessarily inherited, but advised that Thomas should be guided toward occupations that avoid excessive stress or isolation, suggesting that some familial predisposition toward mental illness was recognized even then. At the invitation of the new owners, Professor Alan Matthews, a historian researching Ozark folklore at the University of Missouri, visited the former Whitlock property in October 1952. The layout of the homestead and the location where Eliza's remains had been found were documented by Matthews. His notes, preserved in the university archives, describe the isolated nature of the property. In a narrow valley surrounded on three sides by steep wooded slopes sits the homestead. Even at midday, parts of the yard remain in shadow. The nearest neighbor's house, though less than a mile away as the crow flies, is invisible from the Whitlock property due to the intervening terrain. A person could scream here without being heard beyond these hills. Local beliefs that had developed around the property in the years following the Whitlock's departure were also recorded by Matthews. That travelers passing the abandoned homestead at night sometimes heard a woman weeping or the sound of digging was claimed by several residents of Walnut Shade, who reported avoiding the area. Such stories were typical of many abandoned properties in the Ozarks, noted Matthews, but suggested that in this case they might have originated from actual sounds heard by passers-by during the winter of 1911 to 1912. The acoustic properties of this valley are unusual, Matthews wrote in his field journal. Standing at the former site of the root cellar, I conducted a simple experiment, dropping stones into the remaining depression and noting how the sound carried. Even a small impact produces an echo that reverberates between the limestone bluffs. It occurs to me that if someone were digging in this location at night, when ambient noise is reduced, the sound might indeed travel considerable distances, creating the impression of ghostly activity to those unfamiliar with the terrain. In December 1952, the case of Eliza Whitlock was officially closed, with her death ruled a homicide attributed to Thomas Whitlock. In the Springfield cemetery where her parents and sister were buried, her remains were interred. Brief attention in regional newspapers was received by the story, but it was quickly overshadowed by larger national events. A small file on the case is maintained by the Taney County Historical Society, including copies of the original sheriff's reports, excerpts from Eliza's diary, and newspaper clippings related to the 1952 discovery. A transcript of an interview conducted with Richard Anderson, who had been a deputy sheriff under James Harmon in 1912, is among these materials. That Sheriff Harmon had remained troubled by the Whitlock case long after the official investigation ended was recalled by Anderson, in his late 70s at the time of the 1952 investigation. On several occasions over the years, Harmon had mentioned the case, once remarking that sometimes the law's limitations mean that justice must wait, according to Anderson. That Harmon had suspected foul play but lacked the evidence and resources to pursue the case further was believed by Anderson. When Mary Coleman's oldest son, Robert, contacted the Taney County Historical Society requesting information about his grandparents, occurred the last significant development in the Whitlock case in 1968. That Robert had recently discovered his mother's collection of childhood drawings hidden in their attic after her death from cancer earlier that year, according to correspondence in the Society's archives. A recurring scene was depicted in the drawings, created when Mary was between 5 and 8 years old, a small female figure beneath what appeared to be floorboards or ground, with stick figures standing above. A similar scene with what appeared to be a man digging was shown in one drawing, labeled in a child's handwriting with the words "Mama sleeping." A written analysis that is included in the case file was provided by Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, a psychologist who examined the drawings at the request of the Historical Society. Several characteristics typical of children who have experienced trauma were displayed by the drawings, noted Mitchell, including repetition of disturbing themes, use of heavy pressure when drawing certain elements, particularly the lines representing the ground or floor, and the placement of figures in constrained or buried positions. These drawings strongly suggest that the child who created them witnessed or was aware of a deeply disturbing event involving the burial of a female figure, presumably her mother, concluded Mitchell. The consistency of the imagery across multiple drawings indicates that this was not a momentary fantasy, but a persistent memory or preoccupation. In the summer of 1968, Robert Coleman visited the former Whitlock property, by which time the original house had been demolished and replaced with a hunting lodge. "Standing on that ground, I felt a profound sense of sorrow," he wrote in a letter to the Historical Society following his visit, "not just for the grandmother I never knew, but for my mother, who carried this buried truth her entire life. Some secrets refuse to remain hidden, no matter how deeply they are buried. As a loving parent, but always somehow distant, as if part of her remained locked in that valley in the Ozarks," went on Coleman to describe his mother. That Mary had refused to discuss her childhood and had reacted with unusual anxiety when her children asked about their maternal grandparents, he revealed. "Now I understand why," Coleman wrote. "She was protecting us from a truth she herself could not fully face. That her father, the man who raised her, had murdered her mother and forced her to become complicit in a lifetime of silence. A phenomenon that criminologists would later identify in numerous rural communities is exemplified by the Whitlock case, the way in which isolation and privacy can enable domestic violence to escalate without intervention. In the early 20th century Ozarks, where homesteads were separated by difficult terrain and cultural norms discouraged interference in family matters, a woman like Eliza Whitlock had few options for escape once her husband's mental state deteriorated. Miles away was the nearest neighbor, and winter weather made travel nearly impossible. Even when concerns were raised, as by the midwife Harriet Bowman or teacher Abigail Thornton, the limited resources and jurisdiction of local authorities meant that effective intervention was unlikely. Broader patterns in rural crime and community response were illustrated by Professor Matthews in a paper published in the Journal of Ozark Studies in 1954, using the Whitlock case. Nearly absolute authority over his family in the eyes of the community was granted to Thomas Whitlock's status as the male head of household, he noted. Reluctant to intervene were neighbors who might have noticed warning signs, adhering to the principle that a man's home is his castle. This combination of physical isolation and cultural insulation created conditions in which family violence could occur with minimal risk of discovery or consequence, argued Matthews. Another dimension of the case that has drawn scholarly attention is represented by the psychological impact on the Whitlock children. That the young girl had developed a complex coping mechanism to deal with the trauma she had witnessed was suggested by Dr. Mitchell in her analysis of Mary's drawings. Rather than facing the unbearable reality of her father's actions, Mitchell wrote, Mary appears to have compartmentalized the experience, creating a psychological barrier between her conscious awareness and the truth she knew at some level. This fragmentation of memory is a known response to childhood trauma, allowing the individual to function, but at the cost of complete psychological integration. Part of a larger recreational area is the former Whitlock property today. The history of that particular piece of land is known by few visitors, or the tragic events that occurred there. Across the valley, the limestone bluffs still cast long shadows. And at dusk, when the wind moves through the hollow, some say it carries echoes of the past, sounds that might be mistaken for a woman's distant voice calling from somewhere beneath the ground. Not just the manner of her death, but the silent complicity that allowed her disappearance to go uninvestigated for so long is what makes the case of Eliza Whitlock particularly disturbing. Highly valued was privacy in the isolated communities of the early 20th century Ozarks, and generally avoided was interfering in family matters. An environment where someone could effectively vanish with minimal questioning was created by this cultural tendency toward non-intervention. Our only window into Eliza's experience during those final months is provided by the diary found in 1952. Her growing fear as her husband's mental state deteriorated, her concern for her children's safety, and her increasing isolation from the outside world are suggested by the entries. A woman who recognized her danger but found herself trapped by both physical circumstances and social conventions that offered little protection to wives and mothers is suggested by the entries. Perhaps most haunting is the legacy of silence that continued long after Eliza's death. Along with their mother, her children, particularly Mary, seemed to have buried their memories, creating psychological barriers that protected them from confronting the truth. That some part of her had always known what happened was revealed when Mary's drawings were discovered after her death, that the truth had found expression in her art, even as it remained unspoken in her life. What happened in that isolated valley was not simply the murder of a woman by her mentally ill husband, but the murder of truth itself, observed local historian Margaret Branson, who has studied the Whitlock case extensively, in a 2012 article marking the centennial of Eliza's disappearance. Thomas Whitlock buried his wife twice, first in the ground behind their home, and then in a narrative that erased her existence and replaced it with abandonment. The children, too young to fully understand but old enough to know something was terribly wrong, were forced to participate in this fiction, carrying the weight of an unacknowledged truth throughout their lives. That the most profound horrors often occur not in dramatic moments of violence, but in the slow erosion of safety, in the gradual transformation of home into prison, and in the terrible silence that can descend when those who should protect us become our greatest threat, is reminded to us by the case. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where sound travels strangely and darkness comes early, Eliza Whitlock's story reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary humans whose minds have turned against them and against those they once loved. How isolation can magnify mental illness, how cultural norms can enable abuse, and how the truth, no matter how carefully buried, eventually finds its way to the surface is exemplified by the Whitlock tragedy for those who study such cases. Since Eliza's remains were discovered, forensic psychology has developed tools that might have identified Thomas Whitlock's deteriorating mental state before it led to violence, and laws have changed to offer greater protection to potential victims. Yet, in isolated places where privacy can still serve as a shield for the unthinkable, similar stories continue to unfold. What Thomas Whitlock tried to hide was eventually revealed by the limestone soil of the Ozarks. But for 40 years, Eliza lay forgotten in her unmarked grave, her fate unknown to all but the man who put her there and perhaps the children who carried the burden of that knowledge in their nightmares and their silence. The true horror of the Whitlock case lies in that silence, a silence that spoke volumes to those willing to listen. That Thomas Whitlock likely suffered from what would now be classified as paranoid schizophrenia, similar to his father's condition, was proposed by Dr. Samuel Hirsch, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case records in 1960 for an article in the American Journal of Forensic Psychiatry. The onset of Thomas's symptoms appeared to follow the classic pattern of the disorder, with initial manifestations in his late 20s or early 30s, gradually increasing in severity, noted Hirsch. The progressive nature of his paranoia, beginning with general suspicion of neighbors, escalating to fears about the security of his home, and culminating in the belief that his wife was somehow contaminated or dangerous, aligns with documented patterns of untreated psychosis. What distinguishes the Whitlock case from many similar tragedies, argued Hirsch, was the extended period during which Thomas maintained a facade of normalcy after eliminating the perceived threat. Most familicide cases end with the perpetrator's suicide or immediate apprehension, Hirsch wrote. Whitlock's ability to create and sustain an alternative narrative that his wife had abandoned the family, and to function in society for nearly 2 decades afterward, suggests a complicated relationship between his delusions and his awareness of social norms. He knew enough to hide his actions and create a plausible cover story, indicating that some part of him recognized that what he had done would be condemned by others. Of particular interest to psychologists studying the case has been the children's response to the trauma they witnessed or intuited. A pattern of declining academic performance and increasing behavioral problems following his mother's disappearance is shown by Edward Whitlock's school records, recovered during the 1952 investigation. Instances of what would now be recognized as dissociative episodes, periods when he became unresponsive or appeared to be listening to sounds others could not hear, were noted by his teacher. That Edward may have developed what modern clinicians would classify as post-traumatic stress disorder is suggested by these symptoms. In significant ways differed Mary Whitlock's response from her brothers. More obvious signs of distress were exhibited by Edward, while Mary appeared to adapt more readily to their changed circumstances. That Mary's younger age at the time of the trauma might have made it easier for her to compartmentalize her experiences was suggested by Dr. Mitchell. Children of 3 to 4 years old are still developing their understanding of permanence and causality, Mitchell wrote in her analysis. Mary may have been better able to accept the narrative her father presented because her cognitive framework was still forming. However, as her drawings reveal, the truth remained present in her unconscious mind, emerging through her artwork in ways she could not verbally express. By Mary's adult life is further evidence the long-term impact of childhood trauma. Several characteristics common to adult survivors of childhood trauma were exhibited by her, according to her husband's statements to investigators: chronic anxiety, specific phobias related to the traumatic event, particularly her fear of enclosed spaces and an aversion to digging sounds, and emotional detachment. As if a part of her remained elsewhere, Richard Coleman described his wife as loving but somehow absent. A recognized survival mechanism in trauma psychology is this splitting of consciousness, the ability to function normally in most aspects of life while walling off traumatic memories. By Robert Coleman's description of his mother's parenting style is suggested the intergenerational effects of the trauma. That Mary was intensely protective of her children to the point of causing conflict with his father was noted by him in his correspondence with the Historical Society. She would become irrationally anxious if we were out of her sight for even short periods, he wrote, and she had strict rules about certain activities. We were never allowed to play in the basement, for instance, or to dig holes in the yard beyond a certain depth. At the time, these seemed like arbitrary restrictions, but now I understand they were connected to her own buried experiences. Broader social patterns regarding family violence and mental illness in early 20th century rural America are reflected by the community's response to the Whitlock case. Within a legal and cultural framework that placed high value on family privacy and male authority was operating Sheriff Harmon when he investigated Eliza's disappearance in 1912. A private matter rather than a crime requiring public intervention was widely considered domestic violence. Regardless of his personal suspicions, without clear evidence of foul play and with Thomas presenting a plausible explanation for his wife's absence, Harmon had limited grounds for pursuing the investigation further. Through the lens of their time interpreted the neighbors who noticed concerning changes in Thomas's behavior, his increasing isolation, the unusual modifications to his property, his agitated manner in town, these signs. Poorly understood and heavily stigmatized was mental illness, often attributed to moral weakness or spiritual failings rather than medical conditions requiring treatment. The withdrawal of a family from community life might raise eyebrows, but was not seen as justification for intervention, particularly in the Ozarks, where independence and self-sufficiency were highly valued. Significant barriers to effective action were faced even by those closest to the situation, like Catherine Crawford. No legal standing to demand access to her niece and nephew or to compel a more thorough investigation of her sister's disappearance was had by Catherine, as Eliza's sister. If Eliza were merely property gone missing, the law would take greater interest. She expressed frustration with the limitations of her position in her journal. But a woman who might have chosen to leave, that is considered her right, regardless of how uncharacteristic such an action would be. That the isolated nature of the Ozark communities created perfect conditions for what she termed invisible crimes, acts of violence that remain undiscovered due to geographic isolation and cultural factors, was noted by Dr. Elaine Foster, a criminologist who included the Whitlock case in her 1980 study of rural homicide patterns. In urban settings, Foster wrote, disappearances are more likely to be noticed and questioned. Multiple social connections create a network that makes complete erasure difficult. But in regions like the Ozarks in the early 20th century, a person could effectively vanish with minimal social disruption, particularly women whose social identities were often defined primarily through their husbands. That the 40-year delay in discovering Eliza's fate was not merely a failure of investigation, but a systemic blindness to certain forms of violence, argued Foster. Because it aligned with existing narratives about women's unreliability and the difficulties of frontier life, the story Thomas Whitlock created, that his wife had abandoned her family, was readily accepted. The alternative explanation, that a husband had murdered his wife, was both more disturbing and more difficult to address within the available legal and social frameworks, she wrote. It was simpler for all concerned to accept the abandonment narrative. A crucial role in facilitating both the crime and its concealment was played by the key physical environment of the Ozarks. For those seeking to escape notice, the rugged terrain with its deep hollows, dense forests, and limestone caves has long provided hiding places. During Prohibition, these same features made the region ideal for moonshining operations. That unusual activities would go unobserved was ensured by the isolated location of the Whitlock homestead, positioned in a narrow valley surrounded by steep hillsides, in the Whitlock case. The likelihood of unexpected visitors who might have witnessed concerning behavior was further reduced by the harsh winter of 1911 to 1912, with its heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures. That the limestone-rich soil of the region had inadvertently preserved evidence that might have otherwise disappeared was noted by Professor Matthews in his study of the property. Conditions that preserved both the diary and, to some extent, Eliza's remains were created by the alkaline composition of the soil combined with the relatively dry conditions inside the collapsed root cellar. In more acidic soils or in locations with greater moisture, decomposition would have been more complete, potentially eliminating the possibility of identification decades later, he wrote. This preservation of evidence allowed the truth to eventually emerge, bringing a measure of resolution to a case that might otherwise have remained an unsolved disappearance. The catalyst for an investigation that finally revealed what had happened on that isolated homestead 40 years earlier was provided by Walter and Ruth Simmons when they discovered Eliza's diary in 1952.